have. When Giving is All We Have by Alberto Rios. One river gives its journey to the next. We give because someone gave to us. We give because nobody gave to us. We give because giving has changed us. We give because giving could have changed us. We have been better for it. We have been wounded by it. Giving has many faces. It is loud and quiet, big, though small, diamond in wood nails. Its story is old, the plot worn, and the pages too. But we read this book anyway, over and again. Giving is first and every time, hand to hand, mine to yours, yours to mine. You gave me blue, I gave you yellow. Together we are simple green. You gave me what you did not have, and I gave you what I had to give. Together we made something greater from the difference. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Scott. Okay, so now we're going to do a very brief review of the communication guidelines. Scott is going to put these into the chat again, and we're going to just assume that you understand these now and know them. And if you need to review them again, they have been sent to you in your email. So just reminder of the respect guidelines from American law, to take responsibility for what you say and feel without blaming others, to use empathetic listening, to be sensitive to differences in communication and cultural styles, to ponder what you hear and feel before you speak, to examine your own assumptions and perceptions, to keep confidentiality, and to tolerate ambiguity, because we're not here to debate. There are no winners or losers. And we have some other items that the wisdom of the group added that has to, and I'm not going to read through all of them word by word, but invite you to read them in the chat, which has to do with avoiding using derogatory terms, how to handle if you feel offended or hurt by something somebody has said, how to handle that, and to follow the step forward, step back principle to make sure everybody has enough opportunity to speak and be heard, and in breakout groups to make sure everyone in your breakout group gets a chance to speak. So that's the gist of them. And again, we won't continue to take time at the beginning of our sessions with these, but if you have any questions about them or need to discuss them further at any time, please do not hesitate to let us know that you want to discuss the communication guidelines. Any questions about that? Okay, great. All right, I'm going to toss it back over to Scott for setting up our small groups.
Unresponsive iPad. Work through that. All right, so we are now going to break out into groups of 3, or approximately 3. And this week, we're going to break out for 15 minutes, so each of you will get 5 minutes to speak. And we just ask you the same questions as we asked last week. We'll go into this week without any writing and journaling. Just what came up, one of two things. What came up for you while you were reading this week's chapters, or what came up for you while you were engaging in any of your action reflection practices for this week. So we'll go into breakout groups and each of you can take up to 5 minutes.
All right. Great. I hope you enjoyed your breakout groups. We had a rich discussion in mine, some really interesting perspectives that were shared. And now we're going to go on into our large group discussion. And Scott and I have worked up some questions on the material to bring to you. But before we actually delve into that, I did want to acknowledge that there was a lot of discussion in the book so far about the boarding school phenomenon, right? And what that was like, how that just completely devastated Native communities across generations, and that it is an ongoing legacy and trauma that has ongoing effects. And I just want to acknowledge that because we decided that although she rightly spends a lot of time on it, we're not going to get into that in this session, partly because we know that many of you have been in settings that have been addressing the boarding school issues, like the Becoming Kin class we had in Advent, the Wrestling with the Truth of Colonization that many of you all have done, and other things like that. So what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to put in the chat couple of videos that you can check out if you aren't as familiar with what the big deal about boarding schools is. These are they're brief videos, but they're powerful videos. One made about Oregon and one made about Minnesota, although they both have national scope to them. And so please, if it's not something you've had a chance to delve into, really suggest you you take a look at those videos. And if you would like to unpack the boarding school issue further in another session, please do let Scott and myself know. Okay, any questions or comments on that before I move on into our large group discussion of chapters 4 and 5? Okay, great. So I'm going to kick us off, and then Scott's going to pick up with the next question after that. In chapter 4, Augustine provides a really powerful indigenous reinterpretation of the Jacob and Esau narrative in Genesis and its impacts for generations in the story of the ancient Hebrews, including Joseph, how Joseph interacted with the Pharaoh, and then the implications of Joseph's actions with the Pharaoh on the succeeding generations of ancient Israelites, the exodus from Egypt, and even the settlement of Canaan. And she identifies what she calls the logic of Jacob and shows how that logic that's illustrated, just encapsulated in that Jacob and Esau story, where Jacob essentially deceives Esau into getting the birthright. She shows how that ultimately leads to the genocide of the Canaanites. So what we wanted to spend a little time on was letting folks talk about, what did you take away from that? I mean, she really provides a very compelling indigenous interpretation of that story, and shows how from an indigenous perspective, it's quite a different story than we were taught in Sunday school, or that even I was taught in seminary, in terms of how to interpret that cycle of narratives in the Bible. So what'd you all get out of that? Was that interesting, challenging, compelling to you? What'd you take away from it? And just raise your hand or use the Zoom raise hand feature if you would like to share.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Bonnie.
You're muted. There you go.
Well, one thought that comes to me is that what was happening centuries and centuries ago is still happening today.
Say more.
Well, if Esau are seen as the Indians, the indigenous people, and Jacob as the Western world, that's one way to look at it. But I recall that she ended up, I don't actually, I'd have to go back and reread it to say more. She, Jacob was devious in his actions, and the Westerners have been devious with the indigenous people.
Absolutely.
And Esau is painted, in the Bible as incompetent and impulsive. And I don't attribute those characteristics to indigenous people. So that's why I say I'd have to go back and read that again to follow her train of thought completely. Maybe you can say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, just
somebody else
I see Scott's raised hand, but in a nutshell, the description of Jacob as living in the tents and Esau as being sort of out in the wild, she feels that later people, Christians, interpreted as Jacob being civilized and Esau being this uncivilized, hairy, wild man, who was just, like you said, impulsive, but who, didn't act in a civilized way. Just wanted to feed his face and just like driven by his base impulses kind of thing, not a higher rational thinking person. And that's, of course, how Western Christians like to think of ourselves, not driven by our base instincts and, not living out in the wild, but being very civilized and urbane and all of that. So that's sort of the nutshell of at least the beginning of how she reinterpreted that story. And Scott, you wanted to share something?
Yeah, I think that there's a bit of an important piece missing from the author's depiction of the story. And it's when Jacob decides to return to revisit his home. And he goes back home to the land of his father and the land of Esau. And because of that, I do take this as a cautionary tale. Because be careful of how you might treat someone, because you may need them in the future. And so Jacob, I believe, has a yearning to go home after his, escapades with Laban and all that goes on there. We'll skip over that because that's a long story. But and Jacob has a yearning to go home, in my view, and then is going home and knows that he has to meet Esau, and is
right.
He's terrified. He's terrified of what is going to happen, and sends ahead many gifts, many gifts. Various ways to interpret that. One of them could be reparations, could be. Not sure that was what Jacob was thinking, but it's a possible way to think about it. So I just want to raise that part of the story, that to me it is a cautionary tale, and that it's right there in the Torah.
I'm so glad you said that, because yes, I had that response as well, because I had a fantastic Hebrew Bible or Hebrew professor in seminary who walked us through the story of Jacob coming back to his homeland and finding out that Esau was coming to meet him with all these armed men. And looking at that through the Hebrew was so rich, and how it was about Jacob realizing, now maybe it was a fear-based response, but realizing that he had to do something to make amends to Esau, or he could just be slaughtered, and lose everything that he's just gained. And so, yeah, it's a very powerful part of the story. And so I think you're right that, and she could have included that. I feel like she does ultimately say you can interpret this whole cycle of narratives as a cautionary tale, although she doesn't show the immediate impact. She shows it like generations later, the Israelites are enslaved because of the logic of Jacob. And then that leads to the genocide in Canaan. So, but yeah, great. I'm glad you brought that part of the story up. It's a really important part of the story. Yeah, Neil.
I missed, and I'll have to read it again, anything about Jacob and the powers of Egypt and the Pharaoh. But what I was struck by was the idea that the Israelites come into Canaan and without any justification or whatever, they slaughter the people. They were the other, and they were people that had no rights, and they weren't God's people.
Yeah.
And we, in our own Christian tradition, maybe other traditions too, we read the prophets, and the prophets talk about the Israelites going in and conquering these people, wiping them out. And you wonder why we don't have a commentary to say, is this really God working, or is it our total distortion of who are God's people? And that very distortion is what's going on in Israel and Palestine and Gaza. There's no doubt that the Israelites, the Jewish people, feel this is God's gift to us, no one else. And somehow or other, we see the awful tragedy of Gaza as a result of somehow God is on the Israelites, the Jewish people, the members of Palestine are just to be wiped out. I always hear the prophets saying the slaughter of all the people occupying that land is, I always felt uneven. And then this book gives me an idea of what really that means. That means that we've distorted the whole idea of what we know of God's intentions. And I think we have an obligation to start there even. So
Yeah.
anyway, I'll have to read about Pharaoh and the power of Pharaoh and Jacob aligning himself with that too.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate everything you said. I want to make just one little caution, which is that let's just keep in mind that there are a lot of Jews that are deeply uncomfortable with the policies of the nation of Israel right now in Gaza. And so let's just a caution not to equate Jews and what the nation of Israel is doing. Yes, there absolutely are conservative and, very nationalistic Jews that are supporting that, but there are also a lot of Jews that are not. And so there's diversity in Judaism as there is in Christianity. But we can see that logic. You're right. I think that logic, right, that's in the Bible that unfortunately has often gone uncriticized about, could God really have ordered this? The slaughter of the Canaanites? I mean, that logic we can see that happening in Israel. It's very true. So thanks for that. Other comments on, she talks about she also calls it the logic of the elect, right? Because she talks about how the Puritans and the early colonial settlers, particularly the ones that were religiously motivated, like the Puritans, took those stories about the settlement of the promised land and the Israelites being the elect, and they applied that very conveniently to themselves. right? And they just said, oh, we're just reliving the Bible story. And the indigenous peoples here are the Canaanites. And so we have every right, as the ancient Israelites did, to take this land. And so that's another way to think about it, is that idea that certain people are elect and blessed and called by God, and others aren't, and don't know God, right? Don't know God.
If there are no other comments on this, we can move ahead into our next question, where we'd like to talk about in chapter 5, where the author really identifies missionary logic as problematic. And as Janet said, based on the assumption that we Western Christians bring a message of enlightenment, civilization, proper education, and that we are coming to the other in order to improve them, right? To be more like me. The author talks about all the horrible consequences on indigenous peoples, including the boarding schools, and then really offers us an alternative for thinking about these relationships, using the example of Winti cosmology in Suriname, the belief system of the Maroon people in Suriname, which is an Afro-Caribbean culture. And I'm going to read a few paragraphs from chapter 5 on pages 110 and 111 to kind of introduce us into this, just remind us of what we read. So on page 110, two main characteristics of Winti cosmology are its connection with the ancestors and its relationship with nature. An individual's choices are important because they create problems for future generations. An individual's choices are not only the thing that shapes reality, are not the only thing that shapes reality, because the choices of those who came before also have an impact on the present. The feuds of ancestors may be causing problems for the individual now. In the Winti cosmology, one's actions are influenced by those who came before and have the power to hurt those who will come after. It is therefore important for individuals to understand themselves as part of a web of generations. That struck me, a web of generations. Those who came before and those who will come after. According to our cultural lens, the Western European cultural lens, the individual is the creator of one's own reality. Winti, on the other hand, places the self not at the center of reality, but in a web that includes the past, the present, the future, and the natural world. Individual actions have consequences for generations. An individual is acting on the natural world while also being shaped by the natural world. As in many indigenous practices, reverence or an acknowledgement of one's place in the cosmos is a key practice. And then the author states that she's not an expert on Winti cosmology, but this is just a really high-level summary of it. So we'll recognize that Winti cosmology is probably much deeper than we comprehend, but this is a place for us to start. Like what aspects of the Winti cosmology do you find compelling, and what would change if we were willing to learn from the Wintis and other indigenous worldviews? Thoughts? Don?
So my mind immediately went to trauma and the fact that trauma gets embodied and carried down from generation to generation. And it's the ancestors and it's carried down to our kids too. So there's a lot of truth in that, in the Winkies, what their understanding of reality that we have not focused on in our own culture here. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Don. Allison.
So I'm thinking we have kind of an echo here. No, I'm gonna pass. We've got a complicated audio.
We're not hearing an echo, Allison. At least I'm not. It's up to you though.
I think we would live lives that were just so much less consumeristic. If we were living anything like what's been described in that cosmology, we would be living just profoundly differently. And I would welcome even a 10% shift. Yeah, I mean, I shared this in my small group. I feel that humans are so fallen. And I'm in the group of humans that are fallen because I'm benefiting, enormously from, I'm on stolen land like all of us are. Almost all of us are on stolen land. And all this wealth was built with stolen labor, slavery. And the fact that I know these things intellectually isn't always helping me to then respond in a way that God would have me do, that Jesus would have me do. Clearly, Sarah Augustine, in my view, is living. She's living out the gospel. And I can admire her and I can read about her and I can feel enormous pain as I read about what she and a great many people have experienced. And maybe it's too early in this Lenten series to go to what then shall we do, but it's certainly on my mind, the question of what then shall we do.
Thank you, Allison. Yes, we will get to what then shall we do in our final week. So, start that list, keep that list, absolutely, and we will welcome that in the final week. Elaine, I believe you had your hand up.
I did, coming at it from a slightly different angle to build on what Don said about generational trauma. I had always thought that was like, well, this person grew up in a very abusive environment, so then they abuse their children who learn that and pass that on. And I thought it was all just like in the lived experiences. And then just recently, I've learned that actually trauma can change how our genes operate in our body. It's called epigenetic response. Maybe you all know about this, but I just learned about it. I was like, really? Wow. So it's not just the behavior that you experience, but it's actually the genetic code that you get transmitted that is also impacted by trauma. So I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you, Elaine. Lauren?
I just was struck by the time frame of what she's talking about. We so often live in the here and now, and when you're making and choices that you're making are sort of just, what do I want for lunch kind of choices all the time. That's the way we go through life, and making choices with the thought of coming generations and thinking way beyond your own lifespan is not something we naturally do, and our culture naturally does. And I think that's a really powerful idea.
Thank you, Lauren. Thor?
I was struck by what you said when you were reading about the indigenous people of Suriname taking nature into account. And unless I'm mistaken, I think Christianity has historically given away any, let me rephrase that, has taken total dominion over nature. And I can still recall the time I was in, and yeah, this is related. We were in Ireland, and you think of Ireland as the Emerald Island, right? And it was all, but it was fully treed, right? It was fully treed. And all of those trees were removed. And that was the right of the people living there under Christianity to take those trees and use them for their purposes without any recognition that they were integral to the island. And the same thing is happening in Suriname with the gold mines, where they're just rapacious use of completely unsustainable use of resources, which we've seen all over the world. And it's now it's part of the Western / Judeo-Christian accepted behavior patterns.
Thank you, Thor. Thank you for sharing that. Bernadetta? You'll need to unmute, Bernadetta. Got it. Oh, no. You're muted again.
How the Celtic culture had the respect of the land, the sea, the animals, the rocks, whatever. And how the Catholic Church said, no, you're not to believe this way. You are to believe this way, the other way, and throw out the respect and the love and the concern that was had by the people of the Celts. And that's the same when I read the book, oh, come on. Sweetgrass, what's her name?
Robin
They
Wallkammer.
have the love of nature and the respect. And what really struck me, one of the things that struck me was that the respect for the plants. Okay, these are plants that will feed us, but we take enough for us and we leave enough for the plant to grow and reproduce for ourselves and others next year. You take the whole thing all at once, because these plants do reproduce themselves. But as I'm going through this, and I read a book called North American Saints, and I said, as they were saying what they did, most of the people who were the missionaries wanted the people to believe the way they did. And as long as they didn't, they persecuted them, they killed them, they destroyed them. It's a lack of respect for other peoples and their cultures is really what it is.
Thank you, Bernadetta. Others? Any other comments? I guess I'm thinking of the second part of the question about it's a different approach to engage with another culture and have a sense of reciprocity about it, and to be having a sharing of the wisdom of both cultures, instead of me showing up and teaching Janet what the right way is, actually listening to Janet and sharing wisdom. And that's why I picked the Alberto Rios poem, because it's about a mutual giving, right? And as I was sharing with Lori and Mark, one person gives blue, the other person gives yellow, and out of it we have something different, and that different is green. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I think that's an illustrative of how it would be different if we as Western Europeans, if I as a Western European listen to the Winties and really try to absorb and understand their perspective and yeah, to look forward and to take care of seven generations down the road, because we are in that web of generations. Other thoughts?
Seems to me that there's-
Yeah, Neil.
I was thinking compliments to Don, because I think that poem so aptly showed how we are to live. And often we all think that what they want to do is, I don't know what my thought was initially, but the idea that the river gives and takes and comes back with something new is so true of the indigenous people. And we tend to be users. We tend to be destroyers of anything around us to accomplish a money side or a money advantage. And sometimes it's our own reliance on our own individual rights. We don't have a great sense at times of community, which has to be what you'd look at a river and think of, we're all in this together. And I think at times our own individualism and I'm the special guy destroys some of that ability to go like the river. So it was very, very instructive to hear that poem.
Yeah.
I thought very much.
One river flows into the next.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a sense of the future generations. Absolutely, the interconnection of generations. Lori and Mark.
I just wanted to say that as far as the missionaries, I think that the churches sent the missionaries out definitely with the idea that it's an idea of we're right and you're wrong, and we're going to teach you our right way. And that's what caused all of the indigenous people oftentimes just to completely lose their lives, because they refused to completely, buy into these groups of people that were coming in. But the thing that I was struck by is that is probably the very antithesis of what Jesus taught, and that the church somehow became a group that really was, that did that. I just would like to know how that happened, how it changed from this group of 12, men and probably a lot of women too. And that's what probably made it go. But anyway, to this church that did this, that carried these messages. I don't understand. I just don't understand. That's all I have to say.
Sometimes we're the favored people and we emphasize that. And God is surely behind us, watching us all the way. And if we don't realize, maybe we're not doing what God's intention is. I think that's the problem of the church in general. If it considers itself the elect, the special ones, the ones favored, we get in a very precarious position.
I think we can point to where Christianity aligned with Rome in the time of Constantine, and power became such a motivating force is certainly one root of that. Others? Janet, you want to transition us?
Great. Yeah, just to add on to what Scott just said, Lori, I mean, I think most scholars and today would point to Constantine's conversion to Christianity in AD 312 and the subsequent adoption of Christianity as the official religion of Rome as really that turning point when Christianity ceased being an insurgent countercultural band or religious prophetic movement and became religion of empire. So Well, as a final, just for just a few minutes, just a final discussion question for you all. She had some really cool suggestions at the end of chapter 5 for how to completely re-envision how we think about mission and who you send missionaries to and where the mission field is. And I just wonder if anybody caught that and wants to mention it or say anything about how she re-envisions mission at the end of chapter 5.
I thought that was pretty hilarious. That was my favorite part of these 2 chapters was take the missionaries and send them into the United Nations, send them into the oil companies, send them into the oil wells, send them into to work at the chairman of the board meetings.
Yeah, New York Stock Exchange. Yeah, send them into these places of corporate power, right?
Yeah.
And government power, dominant power, and that's where the mission field is.
I thought that was pretty great.
Yeah. Elaine.
I think it's an interesting idea, and it seems hard to do. There was a book about 20 years ago called Tempered Radicals about how people join, quote, the system to try to change it from within. And I've always kind of seen myself that way, working in the corporate world for 40 years now as an open lesbian, and always advocating for justice for people and such. And then I've recently read about how it's hard for people who are others to change things from within, because if we don't conform to a certain extent, then we just get kicked out of the system. And so you have to be like this. And so you start conforming to the system, and then you're not really that different anymore. So I don't know. I mean, it has me kind of churning around some thoughts in my head.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, and she says, I'm not just joking, she says, I really think we should try this, but I think it's a really great question of, how do you do that without just being co-opted?
And to that point, also, the Washington Post just had an article this week about how Native Americans are really disappointed with the Secretary of the Interior, who is a Native, who's like advocating for lithium mines and copper mines and these clean energy projects that are on what they consider their sacred lands and historical lands. And so, like, I kind of perceive her as being caught in that.
So you're saying Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, is advocating for some of these mines? I had not heard that. That's really interesting. Wow. Oh.
I think that's a link to the article that I just
thank
threw
you.
in the chat. Yeah.
And I see Scott put in the chat. I love Cynthia Bourgeault. He put in the chat a name of a book, The Meaning of Mary Magdalene, I guess is the name of it, on the role of Mary Magdalene and other women in the Jesus movement. Yeah, that looks great. And Dawn, I think you raised your hand. Oh, you're muted, Dawn.
So to be a part of the corporation, as Elaine just talked about, you have to conform. What we need are profits going into these places, right?
Yes.
You're going to get kicked out, right?
Great point. I mean, yeah, great point. Great point. How do you go, in a sense, as outside, being willing to kind of be outsiders and take risks of maybe that's not going to be your career path, And I mean, if you think of the traditional missionary movements, the funding was elsewhere. I mean, they weren't depending on the people they were being missionaries to at least in most cases, I think, pay for their livelihoods. So maybe that's the funding is not from the corporations, which makes you less beholden to them. It's an intriguing thought. Bernadetta.
I remember hearing about a young man who had decided he was going to work at the, you just said it and I lost it, with making all the money and keeping track of the money and so on.
New York Stock Exchange?
Yes, the stock exchange. And he thought he was going to make a career of it. As he got into it, he said, I can't do this. And he left it.
Mhm. Yeah. It can be soul killing. I think many people have that experience.
Sometimes some of the communities that have stock in big blocks, they go as a force to
Yes.
change the directors of the, or at least have the directors see that they're a force to change the direction of a corporation, or they don't put their funds at all in terribly destructive types of corporation outlooks. So sometimes if there is a community with money, it makes a difference. Sometimes they affect the board of directors, or they show their support isn't there anymore. It's interesting when you see either churches or
Yeah.
some kind of gathering of people with stock do something like that. Socially responsible. They say, we don't want to support this anymore.
You're anticipating what comes in the later chapters in the
Oh.
next, she's going to be talking about that. So yes, absolutely. And that's kind of where we're looking at going in this book. Think about some of those options.
Yeah, that comes up in chapter 7. Follow the money. So
All the money.
Follow the money.
follow the money. Yeah.
I've heard that before somehow. Some of you may.
Any
not.
final comments before we anybody
Nancy
who-
had her hand raised.
Nancy?
okay.
Oh, I
Yeah,
was
Nancy?
just thinking what Neil was talking about. Isn't it Network? Remember the nuns on the bus? I think they brought their money together and bought into certain corporations so they could be on the board. And I mean, I love they've got the two. They've got the advocacy one and then the other piece. I think they're really on point with that kind of stuff, that approach.
Brilliant.
There is similar work going on here in Oregon. The Divest Oregon coalition is working to try to on an act in the legislature right now, the Coal Act, to get the Treasury to divest from all coal assets from PERS and other state public funds. There's also a group working for Philippine rights for the Philippines, doing a similar thing, working also with Divest Oregon to try to get the Treasury to divest from several corporations who are particular bad actors in the Philippines and exploiting resources and people in the Philippines. So similar, possible actions to be taken. All right, any final comments before we close out here today? All right, so for next week, your homework are to read chapters 6 and 7, and I'll put in the chat, and then we'll send in the email the choices for action and action reflection. One choice is to undertake the challenge to reimagine our theology away from systems of destruction towards systems towards life-sustaining systems, and to think of someone who you might want to speak to, who would be willing to talk to you about what you're experiencing in this book study, and commit to finding the time to have a conversation with them. I challenged myself. I noticed I was steering away from any of the book study thing and any of the study guide things that had to do with finding scripture. So I challenged myself on this one. That in chapters 6 and 7, the author is going to provide many scriptures to bolster to really bolster the argument. So start a list of scriptures, or add to a list of scriptures if you have one, that support justice for Indigenous people across the globe and support life-affirming systems for all of creation. And item 3 amongst your choices are to show through as the author shows through the example of Everence Financial, as Neil was talking about, about making our voices heard through how we invest. Research where you, your community, your denomination, or your workplace invest their money, and investigate ways to either to divest from corporation with poor humanitarian records, reinvest in those with good or improving humanitarian practices, and or lobby your investments for improving their practices. So Janet, those are your choices for next week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Janet, why don't you take us out with a closing reflection? And we do invite anybody who wishes to stay afterwards to debrief to stay on the Zoom, and we'll have a little debrief afterwards.
And you probably said this, Scott, but since it's not in the chat, and it's probably obvious from what you did put in the chat, but we are reading chapters 6 and 7 for next week, those two. So, all right. Well, today for our closing, as I was thinking about it, sort of what came to me, what sort of moved in my heart was to invite you all to take a moment and maybe close your eyes or just center yourself and bring to mind what is on your heart that you want to be or are praying for right now, and that you would like prayers for. And to put that in the chat if you are so moved, that we can collectively lift up the prayers that we have tonight. And it can be personal or societal prayers, but I just invite you to take a moment and then reflect, and then put in the chat sort of, what are you praying for? What do you want us to pray with you for today? I'm going to start reading these for those who may have trouble seeing the chat. These are wonderful prayers. Ceasefire in Gaza, peace in Ukraine, more compassion, that no one goes hungry or without water. For Lane's sister-in-law who's in hospice, and prayers for her and her brother. Also, ceasefire in Gaza. Prayers for life-sustaining practices for the next 7 generations. For people in Gaza, both Palestinians and Israeli hostages there. People around the world still being harmed by the doctrine of discovery every day. For transformation in how nations relate to indigenous peoples in their borders. For Bob, who is in hospital, bedridden, and can't put any weight on his foot. Protection for LGBTQ plus people, especially youth and trans folks. That we have courage to follow what Jesus would do. For either Lori or Mark's, I'm not sure which one, aunt who was diagnosed with breast cancer. And for the Grand Ron tribal members who do not want any enrollment generation expansion. And maybe some other time, Nina, maybe you can tell us more about that and what that means. So thank you to all of you who have lifted up these prayers. And let's just close together now with a word of prayer. O God, for whom all our hearts are open, to whom all hearts are open, and to whom all our needs and desires are known, we trust that you hear these prayers, which rise to you like incense. And may we retire from our active lives tonight, knowing that you're closer to us than our breathing, and that we truly may find peace in you.
Amen.
And again, we close. We're going to stop the recording and then invite anyone who wishes to stay on for a few minutes to debrief.